Hi everyone. You've already heard the theory about how an autoclave works, and now I'm going to walk you through some of the basics of using an autoclave in the lab. Before we even go and look at the autoclave, I want to make sure that you've got a little bit of background about what can and cannot go into the autoclave, and also how you need to get something ready to go into the autoclave. So in terms of things that can and cannot go into the autoclave, a lot of this is just common sense. You don't want to put anything into the autoclave that's going to melt. So that means you're not going to put most of the lab plastics into the autoclave. So don't put our plastic graduated cylinders, other basic plastics like that. Those will melt, so don't put those in. We do have a couple of exceptions with the plastics. So we have these colored test tube racks that have square holes for your tubes. And you'll also notice that somewhere on the rack it will say Nalgene on them. So these are safe for the autoclave. So these are perfectly fine to use even though they are made out of plastic. It's an autoclavable plastic. We generally don't put these white test tube holders into the autoclave. They are a little bit less resistant than the Nalgene ones. So usually we want to stick with the Nalgene plastic or a metal test tube rack like this one. So metals are something that's totally fine to put into the autoclave. Same with glassware, that would be something that's good to autoclave. Something that you wouldn't autoclave is anything that is flammable. So ethanol, something like that, anything that's like a compressed aerosol can, something like that. You wouldn't want to put that into the autoclave, that would be not very safe. So generally speaking, metals and glass are good to go. In terms of plastic, check with an instructor before putting it in there, unless it's one of these Nalgene test tube racks. We're giving you the go-ahead for these ones. Now in terms of getting something ready to go into the autoclave, there's a few important points to look at. So let's say that I've got a flask full of media and I'm wanting to sterilize this. First off, I want to point out how much media is here in my flask. So I am holding a 1,000 milliliter flask and I've got it filled up to the 500 ml mark. This is the most that you want to fill it. You only want to put half of the maximum capacity into the flask. The reason for that is that as this autoclaves, it's going to boil and bubble, and it's actually going to bubble quite a lot and get right up near the top. So if you've got any more than half in there, it would actually boil over. This flask as it is, even though it's filled appropriately, it's not ready to go in the autoclave just yet. And that's because it doesn't have a top on it. So not only will the liquid eventually boil up and perhaps spill over, when the autoclave cycle ends, it actually has kind of a vacuum setting to get rid of all of that extra steam. And if your flask or tube is open, your media will get sucked up into the autoclave, which not only do you lose your media, it's also extremely bad for the autoclave and will lead to a really expensive maintenance bill. So we always need to make sure that the opening of our flask is covered. One way we can do that is with a piece of aluminum foil. So I've already got mine cut down to a reasonable size. All you would do is set it on top and then squish it over, make sure that it feels nice and tight on there. And then this is ready and covered. The other option for covering your flask is a lot of these have kind of a screw top to them. And for those, we actually have caps to put on. So for the caps, you would screw it down, and you've reached the point where it's now tight. And once you've gotten to that tight point, you actually want to undo it 1/2 a turn. So once you've unscrewed it by 1/2 a turn, you'll notice it can wiggle up and down, but even if I pull quite hard on it, it's going to stay in place. So this means that pressurized air and steam can escape. That's not going to stay inside your flask and cause it to explode, but it's still covered well enough that any of your liquids are going to stay in and not damage the autoclave. Once you've got your container covered up, there are 2 more steps before it's ready to go in the autoclave. The first is to put some indicator on it. So this is indicator tape or autoclave tape. You might be able to see that there's a very subtle stripe going across it. Once that tape goes through the autoclave, that very light colored stripe is actually going to turn black as long as it reaches the correct temperature. So we always want to put a piece of tape on whatever goes into the autoclave so that we know that the autoclave went up to the right temperature. So we'll just put that across the lid, or we could put it on top of the aluminum foil if we were using that. The other thing you want to include, so if you were only autoclaving one thing, it might be okay to put it in without a label, but you're almost never going to use the autoclave with just one item in it. So you want to make sure that your item is labeled with your name, the date, and the contents of your container. And to do that, you want to make sure that you're using the colored laboratory tape. So we've got all different colors around, all of them are fine. The only tape that you want to avoid using is the masking tape. So this beige colored masking tape, the adhesive on it gets really hard and extra sticky, and it's very difficult to clean if you put this through the autoclave. So don't put this on any of your materials going into the autoclave. Instead, use your lab labeling tape, put your initials on there, add on what the contents are, and also your date. And then you can just put that right onto your flask. And this would now be ready to go into the autoclave. Now, media in a flask is just one type of material that you might want to autoclave. Another option can be liquid in test tubes. So for these, you just want to make sure that your test tube has a cap on it and that you've pushed that down. These caps are already vented, these ones that just push on. But some of the test tubes do have screw tops, and if you're using one of those, just use the same rule that we use with the flask. Make sure that it's loose enough that air can escape, but tight enough that the lid isn't going to blow off. And you can fill your test tube rack with as many or as few tubes as you need. If you're only autoclaving 3 tubes, it's kind of nice to space them out just a little bit so that the steam can access each of those tubes easier. And for these, you don't necessarily have to label every single tube, especially if they all have the same thing in them. And you definitely don't need to put indicator tape on every single one. Instead, you can just do a single piece of indicator tape. We can put that right on the end of the test tube rack, and then just give yourself a quick label for the rack itself, assuming that multiple people are putting things in the autoclave. There we go. So now that I've got a label on here, this as well would be ready to go into the autoclave. Now every so often, you might want to autoclave something solid. So for an example, you might be needing to measure out, let's say you're measuring out something like yogurt, so a food product that has microbes in it, and you don't want any extra microbes interfering with what might be in your sample. So for that, you would want to autoclave these solid items. Now, these spatulas here could safely go into the autoclave just like this. However, if that happened, as soon as I open up the autoclave, these are again exposed to all the microbes in the air. So because of that, we want to wrap them. So for that, I would take a bigger piece of aluminum foil. Doesn't matter if the shiny side's up or down, it doesn't make a difference. And I would just put my spatulas in here and wrap them up. Now notice, might be a little bit reflective there, but take notice that I'm putting these down side by side. I'm not stacking them into each other because we want the full surface of the spatula to get that heat and make sure that it all becomes sterilized evenly. So I would just put my spatulas side by side like this. I fold them into a nice little packet. And then I would give my little packet a small strip of autoclave tape. And for these, I can even save myself a step. Instead of using a piece of lab tape, I'm just going to write my label right onto the indicator tape. It's going to be very obvious that these are spatulas, so I'm just going to put my initials on this one so that I know that this is my sample that I prepared. So now we have some items that are ready to go into the autoclave. So next we'll make sure that we transport them safely to the autoclave area, and then I will see you over there and show you how to safely load them into the autoclave. Okay, we're back at the autoclave room now, and we're ready to get our stuff loaded into the autoclave. There are a few important safety points to consider here. I do also want to just point out this spot where I've put my autoclavable goods. So we have this silver cart that sits beside the autoclave, and this is where you're going to put everything that needs to be autoclaved. So if your stuff's good and ready to go, you'll put it here. This is also going to be the spot where you put any used tubes that have had bacteria on them or that could potentially be contaminated with bacteria. So at the end of your labs, you'll be bringing any potentially contaminated glassware back here, and usually we'll have just a test tube rack like this one set up. And just load in your tubes, make sure they don't have labels on them anymore, load them in, and make sure that this time, instead of spacing them out, we're going to put your tubes close together so that we can get as many of your tubes through the cycle in one go. Before we get too far in this demo, I also want to mention you've already heard our autoclave voice its opinion on a couple things. It is noisy, so every so often I'm going to just pause in my instructions to let the autoclave make a little bit of noise. So when we have our items here, these are ready to go, and the great thing about these silver trays that are out here is they are also safe to autoclave. It's often a good idea to put any liquids onto a tray like this so that if they do boil over, they just boil over into the tray and not into the autoclave itself. Above this cart, we have some important safety materials for using the autoclave. So we have our heat-resistant gloves. You're always going to want to wear these whenever you're unloading or loading the autoclave. Even though these are cool to the touch, the inside of the autoclave is very hot, so always wear the heat-resistant gloves. The autoclave can sometimes also have excess steam inside of it, and because of that, we always want to make use of a face shield while loading and unloading the autoclave. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this one on right now so that I'm ready to go. All right, lift this up so you can still hear me. So I'm going to also grab my heat-resistant gloves. And to actually open the autoclave, there is a foot pedal down below. So what I'm going to do, I've got my shield down, touch my foot pedal, and step back and let the autoclave open. Now that it's open, I'll load in my materials. You can see here this one won't quite fit, so we can actually, I'm not sure if that's fit. Yep, so this is another good reason to wear the heat-resistant gloves. There are extra racks in here and sometimes you don't need them, so you bring them out very carefully. And we've actually got a bit of a rubber mat on the floor over here, so I'm going to set it off to the side there just so it can cool. Now I can load my materials. And close the door. Now that my materials are safely loaded in the autoclave, it's just a matter of selecting the correct cycle and starting it. 9 times out of 10, you are just going to use this very first cycle that comes up on the touch screen. It says liquid 20, that means it's a 20-minute cycle. It also says 121 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature that it will run. And then it just, again, indicates that it is a 20-minute cycle. So there are other cycles. There's actually 6 pages of cycles. So every so often you'll be told to use a different setting. And to find those, you can just scroll left to right using the touch screen. Now just to note, this touch screen is not as touch sensitive as your smartphones. You will actually need to use a little bit of pressure, and I find sometimes it even works better to use your fingernail instead of the pad of your finger. So we can select the cycle and it'll be ready to go. I can just hit that cycle and it will start. However, as soon as I do that, it's going to be loud. So I'm just going to tell you another couple things before we get the cycle started. You can see to the side here that we have an emergency stop button. Now this is a great thing to have on because every so often, you know, people make mistakes, and maybe you've started an autoclave cycle and realize that you actually accidentally put something hazardous inside of your load. This would be a situation where you would hit the emergency stop button. Sometimes you get your autoclave started and you realize that, oh shoot, I'm about to run the autoclave for 50 minutes and I forgot to put an item in. If it's something like that, there will be a stop button that comes up on this screen. And that's the one that you want to use for non-emergency situations. The emergency stop button is very hard on the autoclave, so we only use it for emergencies. If it's just, you know, little reasons that you need to stop your autoclave, we'll keep to the stop button that's up on this screen. So let's just go ahead and select our cycle and we'll get it going for you. That is the stop button, the red triangle. All right, and if I do that, it will actually tell me whether or not I want to abort the cycle, and I actually don't. I want to run my cycle, so that's going to keep going. All right, it's about to get loud, so we'll wrap up here, and we'll see you back for showing you how to unload the autoclave. So our autoclave has run its cycle, and I already hit a stop button over on here because it was beeping non-stop. You guys didn't want to hear that, so I already took care of it for you. And now that the cycle is done, I'm ready to take my materials out of the autoclave. Now there's going to be a lot of built-up steam in the autoclave, so here is where it's extra important to make sure that you've got your face shield on, your gloves are on, and when you open the door, you're going to step right away from it. And then once the steam has dissipated a little bit, you can carefully reach in with your gloved hands and grab your materials and bring them over to the stainless steel cart to let them cool down a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate that. I'm going to have the face shield on so I won't be talking through it, and then I'll come back and let you know when we're done. Oh, actually cooled off well. So now we've got our materials out, and I'll just show you my nice little packet of items. So here's something that I actually did wrong. Wet items like liquid media and solid items like our spatula don't actually go together. So when I lifted this up, I've got lots of liquid in with it. It's not such a big deal when it's stainless steel spatulas, but if you had something that actually needed to stay very dry, you would use a dry cycle on the autoclave. But here you can see my indicator tape has changed color. That's showing me that my autoclave got up to temperature. And our technician Melinda does weekly tests to actually test and make sure that the autoclave is staying at the high pressure steam for long enough and actually sterilizing everything. So between those tests that Melinda does and this tape telling me that the autoclave got hot enough, I am quite confident that my items were sterilized. And then the last thing I want to do before walking away is I just want to turn my lid and make sure that it's turned tight. That way we're keeping my contents sterile that are inside of the flask. All right, that's the introduction to the autoclave. Hopefully you've got your key tips for how to keep things safe and how to safely use this piece of equipment. One last thing, if you're the last user on the autoclave, there's this power button right up at the top here. Doesn't actually shut it all the way down, but it does move it to standby. So if you're the last user, make sure that the autoclave moves into standby mode. All right, have a great day.